Hello again everybody. This week we're going to have a go at painting a close-up of a bee on a flower. So you can obviously look for your own reference for this, but something where the insect is pretty close up and you've got some nice colourful flowers that it's against. As you can see, I've already sketched the composition out lightly in pencil, but what I would say to you is think about your arrangement on the page. I'm going to do this as a vignette design, and by that I mean I am going to put a background wash in, which is in fact the first thing I'm going to do in a second, but I'm going to keep it loose so it's like a nice ragged edged wash around the flowers just to throw the flowers out. The flowers are all going to be pinks and mauves, and then obviously I've got the bee itself. But in my reference there's a lot more going on in the picture, so I've simplified it. There are in fact other flowers in the background. I've cut all of those out. I've simplified the number of petals in the drawing. I've put in a leaf and a bud, although in my reference I can see a lot more than that. So when you're looking at the photographic reference you're going to work from, simplify it. Think about your composition, think about the placing on the page, and don't draw absolutely everything out. There's a lot of detail in the petals of the flowers. I'm going to do that with the paint. I've not drawn that out. There's also detail in the wings of the bee, which I've left out. The other thing that I do intend to do with this, which will hopefully make life a little bit easier, I'm going to do 90% of this painting in watercolour, but I am going to introduce just at the end for some of the highlights, particularly the light catching on the wings of the bee, I'm going to use white. Now that white could be white gouache like this, so this is a permanent white, but white gouache, any make, is absolutely fine, so that's opaque watercolour. Or if you don't have any gouache, you will probably have in your watercolour box a Chinese white, so you can use that on top of the watercolour to bring out highlights. So that's what I'm going to do, but I will do those areas right at the end. So any little highlights, and there are some little highlights that will be in the sort of the fur of the bee, if you like, and around its bottom, little highlights like that. We're not going to worry about masking fluid, we're not going to be worrying about leaving tiny little areas of white paper. Those I'm going to put in with masking at the end. So to get cracking on this, I'm going to put the background in first. Now I've just mixed up a selection of greens, okay, so anything that you want, but I don't want my background to be too bright. In fact, my reference, the background is quite bright. This will be watered down more, so I've mixed up big pools of colour in advance, and I'm going to be dropping them in, but not onto dry paper. I'm going to drop in onto wet paper. So the first stage for this is to have a couple of brushes ready, nice big brushes like at least a 12, but anything up to a 16, and I'm going to wet the paper with clean water all around. Now hopefully you're not doing this on a, oh look, there you go, my brush has even got a bit of green in it, so I've already started. You're not going to do this on a really hot day, because this would be quite difficult to achieve, but I am going to wet, and I might even have to double wet in order to get round the whole picture. So I'm going to run clean water off of a big brush around the entire painting first. That will start to moisten the paper and open up the sort of texture of the paper, and I may then have to go back and re-wet, but I've got a smaller brush, and in a second I'm just going to be cutting in with a smaller brush first to come in close with water. Everywhere that I wet, the aim is that my colours will then be able to flow into those areas. So this is the tricky bit, and try not to do this on a baking hot day, because you will struggle. So I'm just going to go quickly but fairly carefully all around. It's important that you're going to work, because we're using large washes, it's important that your watercolour paper is at least 140 pounds in weight, or 300 GM at least, or if not, that you've stretched your paper so that it's stretched down and then you won't get the rucking. You could work off of a watercolour block, which in fact this is, so that the paper is already sort of taped down, and when you finish the painting you have to cut it off the backing. So I'm just literally going around. It doesn't matter if I go over some of the greenery, because that will be the petals, and well, not the petals, I do need to try and avoid the petals, but it will take you a while, so the chances are that you will then have to wet again to keep the paper moist enough to drop colour in, but this will sort of start that process. I've got a piece of kitchen paper at hand, so if I get puddles of water like here, I can just mop that away. This is probably the trickiest bit of the whole painting, so this is why I'm doing it first, because I don't want to try and do this at the end after I spent hours on the whole thing and then think, right, I've got this wrong. But even if it does go wrong, don't forget we are using gouache, so you can go over the watercolour with gouache. So I'm just going to mop up with my bigger brush at the bottom here, because I've got quite an accumulation of liquid. So I've moistened everything. Now if there's still a shine on the paper, you can start dropping in your colour straight away, but mine has dried slightly at the top, which was the first area that I started with, so I'm just going to re-wet with clean water, and then I'm going to go into dropping colour in. So I'm going to start with lightest colours first, and quickly dropping patches of colour, and I will probably be tipping the paper, so you might see the picture go a little bit, because I'll have to pick it up and move it around, but I just want to introduce colour all the way round. This is pale colours first. Pre-mix your colour. You can't afford to stop to mix your colours once the paper's wet. That all needs to be done in advance. So I'm going on with my lightest colour and just touching it into areas. Come down the bottom here. Pick up a couple of different shades, and you can see I've only wet a certain way around the painting. Now I should be able to then ease that in to any little sections with the tip of a good pointed brush. This is about a size 7, I think, so that I cut in quite close. But you can see that everything's still pretty wet. There's a little patch here which has started to dry. Just be careful not to put your hand through your picture. Okay. So I think this is the main area. Tip of the brush just coming in and out of some of these shapes. There are shapes internally, but I don't actually have to worry about those, because I can come back and do those at my leisure, as long as I've got enough colour mixed. So it's this intricate outside bit that I do have to concentrate on before it has a chance to dry. Okay, now I've got some slightly deeper colour, and I'm just going to touch that in here and there while this is still wet, because I want a blotchy out of focus effect in the background. So I'll get some of these patches down, and then you may have to tip the paper to get them to blur together. So I'm just going to move it backwards and forwards very gently. It should only move in to the areas that you've wet if you tip it gently. If you go too mad, it will run over your picture. But this way, I just want a soft, out of focus background in light greens around my flowers. So keep moving it around until you're happy with the effect. If you want to drop more colour in, the shine's still on the paper, you can do that. But if you're happy with what you've got, that's going to dry, because bear in mind it will dry 40% lighter, so that will dry quite pale. I am just going to go down to a much smaller brush, and there's some little touches, so about size 3 or 4, and there's some little touches that I can bring in for tiny patches that have been left out, so I can come in and bring detail in, because there's plenty of wet still on the paper. So just coming in where I've left anything out. Now, there's little bits of excess colour again accumulating, so before I leave this background, I'm just going to use a point of a brush to mop the colour. I won't blot with the kitchen paper because that will lift too much colour off, but I'm just going to use the tip of the brush to pull out any puddles of excess, and just keep sitting there watching it until you're happy that the puddles have stopped forming. I'm just mopping up and wiping the excess on kitchen paper. And if you get little sort of troughs of colour, say your paper has cockled a little bit, then you can just mop up in those little puddles and then just sit and watch, and eventually you should find that the little patches stop forming, and then you can walk away and leave it. But be patient with this, and hopefully when it's dry I'll have a nice soft blurry out of focus background. Now that my background has dried, the other thing I did do was I came in and just did the little areas that were in between, you know, in little gaps inside. So they're done and the whole thing's now dried. So I'm going to start work on the petals of the flower. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to start with this flower over here on the left of my picture, just so that I don't drag my hand through what I'm doing. So in advance I have mixed up a selection of pinks and mauves, diluted to different strengths, some very pale, some very much stronger, and I'm going to work sort of a petal at a time, dropping wet in wet colour in. There will be areas of white paper that I will leave, and there'll be bits where there are darker markings on the petals that I'll come back and do later. So I'm going to start with that left-hand flower and begin building up the wet in wet washes on top of that. So for this one I'm going to use a brush that's got a good point, nice size 8 brush that's got a decent point to it, and again as usual starting off with the palest colours first. So I've got some nicely diluted pinks, things like permanent rose, quinacridone magenta. You can use, those are the brighter pinks, but if you want to use something that's a little bit stronger, then you've got alizarin crimson, rose madder. Whatever you have in your box, you can work with whatever colours you like, and I'm putting a small amount of colour down and then moving it round with clean water so that I can then drop stronger colour in to those wet mixes, one petal at a time. I'm not trying to do too many petals in one go because I want to get some shape forming. I've specifically not wet the entire petal. You can if you want to. You have a little less control if you do, but I'm working sort of one petal at a time and moving things around with clean water so that I can control where I want my washes to flow and get the direction that I want the petal to form. So I'm taking my washes down and fading the colour out. I want a little bit of white paper at the base here, so I can just fade the colour away. And then while that is still wet, as I say, these are only the palest washes, I can begin to drop stronger colours in. But when I say stronger, this is still the palest set of colours. Bear in mind again the rule that as you're building your colour up, so you should drop in slightly stronger mixes of colour into the wet so that you don't get cauliflowers forming all over the place. So these are my delicate, but every colour that I'm putting in is a little bit more, has a little bit more pigment in it. These will all dry really pale, and I'm not after a botanical painting, so I'm not concentrating on getting every little botanical detail into this. This is just a sort of a loose wet in wet, but trying to get it obviously to look like the geranium that it actually is. So I can feed with the point of the brush, just feed in my stronger mixes of colour. I'm just going to start bringing in a little bit more of the mauve. The paper's still wet, so I can bring a little bit of stronger mauve in at the top. If your colours don't run together enough, then do what we did with the background, which is just tip your paper. But I'm concentrating one petal at a time, and I will come back and put stronger markings in to this later. I am actually going to bring a little bit of blue tone through into this as well, so it'll mix on the page. So I'm just dropping a little bit of blue. This is my Windsor blue red shade, and I'm going to drop a touch of that in so that it mixes on the page with my purple. But by the time you see these dried, they will be quite pale. So gradually working round. Now what I need to do is, logically you'd think I move on to the next one, but if that hasn't dried, I don't want the two colours running together, so I can skip out the ones either side and go to the opposite, so that it's dry paper in between. So this particular petal is very pale, so very diluted pinks, moving it round with some clean water. There's sort of a stamen in the middle which I can more or less ignore because and paint over the top of it. Because it's darker. So establishing my pinks, and again I'm not using just one pink, I've got a variety of shades. You'll end up with a much more interesting painting. Whatever flower it is that you end up drawing or painting, try not to say it's an orange flower. Don't just do it one flat orange. Mix a variety of shades, some with a little more red tone in it, some with a little more yellow tone in it. You'll make it much more interesting if you vary the colour, and instead of just using one flat shade of orange and just making it thicker or thinner. Variety will make it much more interesting. So I'm keeping this petal quite pale. Try and leave a little bit of white just at the top there, so I'll blot a bit of my colour off just in that top corner. And while it's still damp, bring a bit of mauve in. Same on this side, just a little streak of mauve. Back to the top, a little tiny bit more pink coming in just at the top. I want that petal to be fairly delicate, and down towards the bottom here around the base of the stamen, it's a pale pink wash. And again, just clean water to fade the colours out. Slightly more peachy pink. So really delicate. It's not totally white paper in this section. Although there is a bit of very light where that wash has just come over the top. This petal will just use a bit of water. Blot that away. Bearing in mind that most of the pink shades are fairly staining, so if you do want to retain white paper, then bear that in mind. But we are going to be using gouache with this, so if things just get a little bit out of hand and run a bit further than you want, we can rescue. But the aim is not to paint the entire thing in gouache, so try not to go too mad. Now that those two have dried, I can move, the edge of that has dried, I can move back to this petal, and I will just demonstrate, or try to demonstrate this one. So the palest base colour for this one is the mauve. I'm going to come in with some mauve, light mauve, as my sort of base wash. The petals are fairly sort of papery looking on the geranium, so I can leave some sharp edges that will work quite well with these. A little bit of pale pink coming into that. And then as it comes down towards the base, so the colour gets much stronger, so I'm going back to my permanent rose or quinacridone magenta, dropping some of that in at the bottom off of the tip of the brush. But I don't want to leave it as an abrupt end, so fade it in with clean water. And then back to my purples, deeper purples. I'm going to actually drop a bit of blue in first. And then a bit of stronger touch of purple. Whole section of the petal at the bottom here is darker, so I'll put the purple down and a little touch of blue into that. I'm using cobalt blue deep in here. It will granulate, so bear that in mind, that some colours are going to granulate, get that speckly look to them. Others won't, depending upon what effect you like, but I quite like a little touch of the granulation coming through. So I know that they look slightly bitty at the moment, but I'll let that dry, and once I come back with the markings on top, they will start to work quite nicely. There's a small petal in between which has got some green tone in it and some pink, so I'm going to go back to my light green mixes and put a sort of a base green down in that gap. And then bring some pink, fairly strong pink in, and while it's still wet, let them run down. Just leave a little bit of white at the top. And where the colours touch, you should get quite nice bleeding of colour together. Okay, and I'm just going to go a little bit darker just at the top with a bit of alizarin crimson, I think, where the pink gets a bit darker. So touch a bit of alizarin crimson in. In fact, I just need to make sure that it's a strong enough mix so that I don't get cauliflowers forming. So I'm just going to touch that slightly deeper pink at the top. And around the top edge. And let the colour travel on its own. We'll see how that dries. I've got to do that on these two petals as well. And I'm just going to leave that once I've done the base on all of those, and move on to the next flower and do the flower around the bee, the petals around the bee. Exactly the same thing on that as well. Hopefully you can see now that I've worked my way round getting washes on most of the petals, working wet in wet. You can see I've used cobalt blue deep, so I hope you can see in places there's a little bit of granulation, but I quite like that because it gives a bit of texture to the petals. I can at a later date go back and put some more markings on those, but I thought what I would do is demonstrate the final petal with the wet in wet down the bottom before I start working on the bee itself. So again, as usual with everything that I've done so far, I'm going to start with my pale washes first, which will wet the paper off of a decent sized brush. This is my size 8 that's got a good point, and I can get my very pale pink, and that's the equivalent to, you know, wetting the paper by washing the pale pink as a base colour down with a bit of variation. So I'm picking up water and moving it around with some water, and that pale pink will allow me to then drop other colours in, and I'm going to run that right to the edges of the petal. If there's any areas that you want to keep as white paper, don't forget you can. You'll notice I have actually run over the foot of the bee, which is fine because it's darker, so I don't have to worry about that. I'm just going to mop up any excess colour and then start dropping in some diluted mauvey tones into this. So working from the top of the petal, dropping some mauves in, reload my brush and bring some more in, and that pale pink is the base which lets everything flow. Around the bottom. Right up to the edges of the petal. Okay. And I'm just going to soften the top edge a little bit with some damp brush, not wet because I'll get more cauliflowers forming. And then into that I can start strengthening the colour. So permanent rose, dropping some of that into the middle of the petal. That's a little bit stronger. Bear in mind we're dropping in wet, so each time you drop in a colour it's got to be a little bit deep, a bit more pigment in it than, so it's a slightly thicker consistency than the layer before. So I'll bring a few areas of that in. I don't want the whole petal to be flat, so I'm trying to vary it across the petal to create some shape. And then I will go in with a stronger mix of my cobalt blue and permanent rose to bring in. So I've just got to make sure that there's more pigment. I'm just strengthening that up before I start to drop that in. Taking some lines across the direction that I want the flower to fall. So if there are marks left in the watercolour, it's falling in a way that's going to describe the shape of the flower. Gets a little bit deeper down the bottom here. Stronger pink in the centre, so strengthening up my permanent rose in the middle here. And deepening with some purple, I think. So this is all being done onto wet paper. I can see the sheen on the surface of the paper, so I know it's wet enough for the paint to carry. And as I say, this is not a botanical painting, so I'm not worrying if it's not, it doesn't have to be botanically accurate. I'm trying to get it, pretty good, but back in with a little bit more mauvey wash. Just got to be careful when I use water to soften edges, because I will get cauliflowers appearing. I think I'm nearly done on this last petal, and I will go back and just with a damp brush try and pull some of the colour down towards the base. If it's wet, I'll get edges forming, but if it's just damp, I'm just going to tease the colour down. Try and make it look as though that petal is joined to the centre of the flower. That might even be easier to use. Go back to my size 4 and use that. So the colour's just eased towards the base. Right, I'm going to see how that dries, I think, and if I'm happy with that, that's the last of the petals, and it would be time to move on to the bee. So now that I've got all the basic washes completed on the flower, and I've just put some pale greens where I've got a bud and a leaf, which I can come back to later, I'm going to concentrate on the bee. So the bee is the main event, and I've got colours mixed in advance. We're going to start with the lightest colours first. So because I've been mixing with gamboge, I'm going to use gamboge for the colour of my bee. And I've got gamboge with a little bit of alizarin crimson to give a two-tone colour to the striping on the bee. Start with the lightest colours on your bee first, because you don't want the dark colours to bleed into it. So I'm going to put my lightest wash down first, and I'm going to make sure that I use a fine brush. This is about size 2, and I'm going to put my lightest yellow down over the whole of that yellow area on the bee. This is a fairly strong mix because I don't want to have to do it again. I'm going to actually take the colour through the wing in places, because some of the light highlights on the wing can be put in with gouache on top. So where there are bits of yellow coming through into the wing, I can actually just take the colour through and paint over it later. So I will run some of that yellow through it and out to the other side, and not worry about the fact that the wings have got highlight, because that can be gouache or Chinese white later on. So I'm just going to take that colour through, making sure the top edge is nicely uneven for the sort of hairiness of the bee. Pull that out, and then before it has a chance to dry, I've got some, again, gamboge, but this with the alizarin crimson in it, to make a slightly more orangey tone, and I'm going to touch that in to the wet colour and just let that creep across. So again, a fairly strong mix of colour. So we're working on this idea of two-tone again. I'm going to let that dry. It may need to be a bit darker, but if I put that all in now, then it's going to get very muddy looking. So down at the bottom, my bee has a deeper stripe. So rather than going in with the lightest colour first, I'm actually going to use that more orangey colour and make sure that I get a wash of that in. Nice uneven edge to it. It doesn't matter if I go over my pencil lines, because I can always take the dark part of the bee into it. So you can be more generous knowing that the dark part of the bee is going to cut, or can cut in. So it doesn't matter if your band of yellow is a bit wide. It's better that way round, because you can bring the dark in. So I'm going to make sure that I'm fairly generous on my little sort of broken edges. Get slightly lighter in parts as I come round the bee. So I'm going to pick up a little touch of my lighter yellow and just drop that in. But at this point I'm just making sure that I have lost all of the white paper that I don't require. I'll take the hairiness up a little bit higher actually, knowing I can cut back. Okay, now while that has dried, I just want to tone that down slightly, so I can take a touch of purple that I've used in the flower, complementary opposite of yellow on the colour wheel, and I can just touch a bit of that sort of purpley mauve in, just here and there, off of my fine brush, to give a bit of variation. So I'm not washing it over the whole thing, but little patches. So again, we're doing wet in wet, but on a very small scale, and it will just give a bit more 3D to the bee without painting literally every hair. So this is not a thin mix, this is a fairly wet mix, a fairly thick mix, sorry, and so because I'm putting it into wet paint, it's running, but it's not running too far. So if it's too wet, it'll just go right across. So I get a little bit of 3-dimension in this way, and you can just keep touching that in until you're happy. Because this part of my bee is slightly in the shadows. So I'm just using that mauve, complementary opposite to the yellow, to get a bit of 3-dimension. Now, it is actually still slightly damp at the top here, so I could push my luck and drop a little bit of that in up the top here as well, which would be quite nice. Link the top and the bottom. I think it's dried over this side, so there is actually, it needs to go a bit deeper in between the wings here. So this part I'm going to actually paint in with my small brush a bit more substantially. This is in between the two, position of the two wings. And once this is finished, I'll wash that across with a bit of water. Once this is finished, I need to let this dry before I go on to the dark stripes. In fact, it will be dry, it's quite warm in here, it will dry and I can start working on the darker sections. So we've got that part, but I think because I've got some of these yellowy tones, I might actually come down and get some of those washes onto the legs. I'm going to use a little bit of the colour that I've used on the body of the bee. There's some slightly sort of orangey, pinky tinges on the legs, which I can put down as a base colour, knowing again that I'm going to come on with darker bits later. So I'll get this orangey tint down first as a base wash. So it's just going to have a dry as a very sort of light orange, or even a little touch of pink. I might even put a little bit of the permanent rose in there just to catch. And come up. Now there are some almost pale blue highlights on the legs, so I don't want to take that peachy colour too far over, but there's a little touch there, and there's also some where I can see the back leg as well, which disappears into the flower. So I'll wash some down into the shape of the back leg here. It gets quite complicated as the limbs of the bee disappear into the flower, so what you can't see, don't try and make it up. I'm just literally painting what I can see, which for me are bits of pinky highlights. I can't make out too much shape, but I can sort of see a little bit of colour. So I'll drop that in. So it comes around the back of the leg there. And then on this front leg, I've got some sort of almost soft peachy colour around here. So I'll put a little pale wash over that, again, over the whole area, knowing that I can come back and go darker later, but that peach base colour's down. Oh, and it's on the little sort of antenna bits as well. So I've got some, it needs to be a bit more pink, I think. Okay, and this leg also has a little hint of the pink coming through. It's quite dark, but there is a little touch of warmth, so I will just run a bit of the pink over that. And let it dry. There's a couple of areas where there's some blue, as I mentioned, so again I'm going to link it with the blue that I've been using in the flowers, so I'm going to use some of my cobalt blue and just put a hint of that on this leg, and use some water just to fade colour down. From there, and little touch on this and a antenna bit at the bottom here. Right, I think that's the main bit on there. They've got some really pale pink sort of catching on the fluffy bits on the back of the bee over here. So very diluted pink. I think it's more reflected colour than anything else. Just washing a little bit in to there, and also just catching a bit of very pale gingery yellowy colour just on the back edge here. So put a little bit down and use some water to fade it across. So I don't want to lose all the white. Right, and there's some of that peachy tone down at the front here as well, just around this fluffy bit on the leg here. Really pale. Hint of colour, which I can use a bit of water to fade round. So I think that might be all of the sort of the palest set of washes to go on. We're going to start working on the bee, working from the back, working our way down, again, so that I'm not dragging my hand through the colour. So I've got some really deep colours mixed. I've got Van Dyke brown with a little bit of Payne's grey in it. I've also got some of my cobalt blue and some Payne's grey on its own. So again, even though these stripes are dark, I don't want them one flat colour. Much more interesting if you break it up. So I'm establishing the outer edge with my fine brush, my size 2. I think this one's a size 2, yeah, size 2 brush. So I'm establishing this with the first lightest, if you like, of my dark colours. And making sure that I've got use the tip of the brush to pull out my fluffy edge. Then I can drop other colour in. So I'm going to come up to the edge of the wing and then pick up some of my cobalt blue. I'm going to just drop a little bit of cobalt blue in there. And then I've got some nice, strong, slightly thicker mix of Payne's grey. You can use whatever colours you want, but I'm now going to pull strokes down into the yellow to try and do that fluffy edge to it. And then touch the colour in. We'll see how this dries. I may have to come back and go in darker once more, but I'm just going to pull that round, go back to my slightly lighter colour, which was the mix with the Van Dyke brown in, and come round the side here. Pick up a little bit of my cobalt blue. Drop a bit in there. Just a touch, and then back to the darkest mix. So we're doing mini wet in wet as I come round this sort of top of the leg, if you like, controlling it off of my brush and fluffing out the outer edge. Back to the Van Dyke brown. think what I might even do at this stage is I've got a tiny rigger brush, which is that brush that's got the longer bristle to it, and I think what I'm going to do is use the tip of that and just pull out some really fine fluffy lines just on that outer edge. So I can get even finer with that. There we go, and then back to my small brush with the Van Dyke Brown around here up to the edge of the wing. I'm just going to use that rigger again just to pull a little bit of colour while it's wet over that edge, and then down again, drop a bit of blue in, just gives a bit of a sheen, and then back to my neutral mix. Neutral is a very dark grey if you haven't come across it before, but you've got to use whatever you have in your box. So you might opt to go with something like sepia if you've got sepia, which is extremely dark brown, and then add something like a dark purple in there maybe to make, or even a dark blue to make something that's really deep and rich. So just go with what you have in your box. So this comes round to sort of the top of where the leg is. All the time I'm glancing at the photograph, just looking at the colour variations as I work my way round the bee. And again, changing my colour slightly as I come round the top edge of the wing with the Van Dyke Brown. Go back while the wet paint is there with my rigger brush and pull that through. I've still got to come back and do the leg, but I'll do that in a bit. I just want to make sure that I've got these colours flowing and a nice loose edge to them. Around the top edge of the leg, there we go. And actually the dark runs straight into that top leg, so I might as well take that straight down there to the little sort of joint, and I'll finish that there, and then back to my rigger brush and flick some of the colour up into the hairy bit there. So this is how I'm going to carry on going around the bee. Back to my blue again. I'll come into the middle section, I think, and bring some of the blue into this middle section. And then pick up my Van Dyke Brown, drop that in. And then finally into the neutral. These are all really strongly mixed because I want this to dry. I don't want to have to go over too many times. I may have to go back in once, or maybe once before I bring the highlights in with the gouache or Chinese white. but I don't really want to have to go over. I want this to be quite fresh. So I'll use my rigger brush again and flick the colour out to give the hairy look. To lose the last of my white paper. So I come round the edge of the bee. Hairs seem to get a little bit longer here. And I'll just finish off that bit at the front as well. In fact, I'll go into the Van Dyke Brown just for this front section. Back to my larger brush, just to fill in there. And then I've got this section here at the back to do where I've got remaining white paper. So go in with the Van Dyke Brown up to the edge. I am going over part of the wing. This is where the colour comes through. And again, just make sure that I lose all the white and have a little jagged edge. But don't worry about any highlights because that's going to be the gouache run on top. So I can wash the colour down, lose all of the light areas. And just feed a little bit in at the back there with my grey. There we go, so we've got a bit of variation. So I'm going to leave that to dry. I've just got to do exactly the same same thing on this little front section, and we'll see how it dries. As you can see, I've been working on the leg areas and the antenna, so I've just left this one leg here to show you. That was the original wash that we put down. It's now bone dry, and I can start coming on with the darker colours. I'm using really small brushes, size 2, and a very small rigger brush. I think it's a 0. So I'm going to begin by putting the darks in. I think the easiest thing to do will be to start at the tip. So I've got some alizarin crimson, which I'm going to add a tiny bit, I think, of the Van Dyke Brown to that to make it more of almost a maroony colour, and I'm going to come in with that over the top of the base colour that we put down. Now there are almost little sort of rings, as you like segments in the legs, so I can leave a section of the base colour, that orange tone that we had down there, and leave little segments of that. So this is really tiny work, but just to give the impression of the segments of the insect's leg. So I think there's 1, 2, about 3 segments. So I've done 1, 2, and we'll come up for the 3rd sort of segment. Just to give an impression of those sort of sections, if you like. And then I need to start coming in with the deeper brown tone in the main section of the leg here. So I can run the dark in. I'm going to use a bit of water to move it round. I don't want it to be too solid a wash. So even off of a small brush, and just make sure I leave a little bit of light for the end of that segment and a little band at the top. And then now that's wet, I can go back and touch deeper colour into it. So we're doing mini wet in wet again. Run a little bit of dark along the bottom. In fact, there's no light on the bottom section at all, so we can come right across there. that's, I've got that dark, I'm just going to come back and put a tiny bit more dark in some of those segments. There we go. So, and I think just use a little bit of water just to lose the light edge there at the top of that part. Now this bit, that part of the leg has got to look like it goes behind the other. It doesn't quite do that. So I'm actually going to use a touch of that maroony colour. I'm just going to darken the end of this leg down a bit there to push it behind the other one. Okay, right, I think that's, we'll see how that dries, I think. Just got to make sure that goes round the corner. I've got that quite, but I'll move to the rigger because that will just let me go round, take that dark around the corner. That's better. Okay, so I'm going to leave that. Now we need to look at the wings, and this will have to be done in a couple of stages. So I need to actually get the transparency of the wing. I'm going to put the highlights on using gouache. You can, if you want to paint really carefully, leave sections of white. You can do that, but I'm going to go with gouache on top. So I need to look at the colours that are coming through the wings, and on my particular bee it's actually shades of green. The greens that I used in the background are coming through. Now I could have washed my background right over that wing, but I think I would have got a bit lost, which is why I didn't do that to start with. So I've still got those puddles of green ready, and I'm going to actually wash those over the whole of the wing section first. In fact, we could even move up to a bigger brush for this to do it quickly. So if I take my size 8 brush, I can get that colour down. But again, variation of colour, because through that wing the colours do change, but bear in mind that you've got to look at what you worked with originally. So I'm not going to go too dark, but I'm just going to put my wash through. And it gets a bit deeper as it comes down to where the wings meet. A little bit darker over here. I get a bit of variation. Okay. Touch a few streaks in there. I just want to make sure that I've got no white paper showing through. So I'm using a brush that's got an excellent point to it to get that coming through. Now it does go a little bit darker at this point, so I might even use a little bit of my purple, my dark purple, and just have a touch of dark purple just bleeding into the edge of that wing. I think that might look quite nice. Just coming down the edge. You do need a bit of a steady hand for this. If you are worried about not having a steady enough hand, you could always use coloured pencils. Put the base washes down with watercolour, put any highlights on using gouache, but if you need to do fine lines right at the end of the painting, use a sharp coloured pencil and actually draw some lines on with coloured pencil. So if you're not too confident about how steady your hand is, you could try that as an alternative. While that wing is drying, I need to get rid of, get the colour that's showing through on the other wing. So in this instance, it's mauves. So I'm going back to the colours that I had ready. I've got some of the mauve already coming through, but I just need to wash mauve through on some sections. Comes down to meet the yellow. And again, just make sure I haven't got bits of paper I don't want showing through. And then there is some green. It does meet with the green. There's a hint of green coming through on the wing over here. So I can put a bit of green down and wash that through, and then back to the mauve and let the two colours touch so that we get a blurred edge. And then if I progress down, we've done the yellow bit, and we then come into the dark part of the bee. So if I look at my colours that I've worked with, I've got my greys and purples. So I'm going to put grey down first. In fact, I'll move back to my, don't do tiny brushes where you don't need to, so I'm going to go back to my larger brush, get that down quickly so that I've got time to drop some colour variation in it. Again, it will look much more interesting. So I can come down with the grey, and while that is still wet, I can bring a little bit of my sort of purpley blue again into the wing. So run a bit in there. This is a thicker mix again, don't forget, and I'll run a little bit over this side as well. So that should work quite nicely. In fact, that even goes up into that part of the wing, and we'll have a few darker streaks going through. So back to my greys, and I'll streak in using some thick colour, a bit of darker. Darker grey. And this will be my base upon which I can then build up the transparent look of the wings, but I need to stop and let that completely dry. So while that's drying, I'm just going to go back and finish off bits in the flower. So I'm going to go and get the stamen in the centre of that flower, work some greens into the buds and the leaves, and that'll give the rest of this a chance to dry completely. So the last thing to do will be to finish off the wings and put my little gouache highlights in. I've now finished the flowers themselves. I've gone along, put some washes on the buds and the leaves, but I've also gone and put on my particular geranium, there were are these patterns, these sort of veining. And what I've done is used all the same pinks and mauves that I had mixed and started these veins, and then just used water to fade them out and try and follow the contours of the flowers. It's entirely up to you. You could leave your petals plain if you wish, but I decided to put the veins on because I thought it helped give shape to the petals. But I'm now in a position where the wings are dry and I can start the final stage really, which is working on the wings. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the darks in, because the last thing I'm going to do is use the gouache or the Chinese white, whichever you've got, to put highlights on top. So this is a sort of this is a purple, a deep purple that I've mixed with the same pinks and blues I've been using, and a little bit of neutral in there. And coming off of a fine brush, using something that's got a really fine point, I'm just looking at where there are little dark accents. Now, I don't want to paint every single one in, I just want to give an impression of this almost like a stained glass pattern on the wings. And they're not all as dark as that, so I think I'm going to use a little bit of one of the pinks to lighten the colour slightly so it's not quite so intense. And put some of these darker bits in. At the end of the day, you get lost with the pattern, but as long as I do a sort of an impression of that pattern, that's what I'm after. So I'm going to wash in some shaping to these transparent wings and look at it like little sort of stained glass or veins, whatever, however you want to look at it. Get a bit of shaping in, and again I'll do a little touch of wet in wet, so touch a bit of colour in to get some variation, but leave some of the base colour to come through. So this is just an impression over the top. And then use water to fade the colour hopefully we'll start to get the effect of the wings. Come down with some, I've got some neutral, which I'm just going to dilute a little bit. That's this grey tone, and start bringing some pattern across. So the dark's going to come in. I can see these sharp sort of patterns, the crisp edges in the lower sections of the wing. So this is a fairly strong mix of colour. I'm just trying to follow shapes. It's really just painting shapes at the end of the day. It's not trying to make a grid out of it, but just looking at the shapes, and I'm painting the negative spaces, if you like. Some of the edges are a bit softer, so some of them I can use a little bit of water to blur. And some bits the colour changes, so I'm going to bring a bit of neutral in. Fade that away down the wing. And we've got slightly deeper colour over here. Again, I think I'll use just a bit of water to fade that off. Another shape. Coming through. So basically what you need to do is work your way across the wings, putting these darker bits in first before you think about putting highlights in. So you get basically all the darker colours that you want into position, and that's what I'm going to carry on doing on both wings to begin with. And then the final stage will be putting highlights on the wings and on the sort of hairs on the body of the bee. Now that I've completed the darker highlights on the wings, we're at the final stage. So it's using either a little bit of Chinese white or ideally some white gouache. Now I'm going to start off with pure white gouache for some of the highlights on this wing. And then some areas are not quite so bright, so you can tint your white gouache or your white Chinese white with other colours. But we're now going for things that are a bit more opaque, so I'm just going to do the brightest highlights in pure white off of a really small brush. So what I've actually done is I've added a tiny bit of water to my colour, just to the white, just to allow it to flow off of the brush a little bit more easily. And you should see that this will sit on top of the other colours really well. I'm using permanent white, but obviously there are other shades of white, and some makes of gouache are thicker than others. So you may find that some of those that are slightly thinner consistency, you'll barely have to add any water to, whereas I'm using a Winsor & Newton, and for me I have to add a little touch of water to that to make it flow off of the brush. So these are the areas, and I'm again using the rigger where I want absolute white highlights initially, and this should make the wings stand out beautifully. I'm working my way across, putting the highlights in, and hopefully this will give the effect of it catching the light. And it's much easier doing it this way round than us trying to apply masking fluid off of tiny applicators at the start. Now the gouache is thickening already slightly, so I'm just going to add a little bit more water. So you have to do that, keep doing that, or you will struggle. But apply it not in a washy consistency, but in quite a thick consistency, but enough that you can get it to flow off of the brush. So again, I'm following shapes. I'm just following little shapes and highlights in the wings. Not solid lines necessarily, but little dabs and shapes. And I'll work my way down the wing. Actually, the biggest highlight is down here. And obviously it looks most effective against the darkest part of the bee. So I keep flicking my eyes to look at the reference to see the shapes that I'm trying to follow. And again, as soon as it starts to judder, the gouache, and not flow smoothly off the brush, just put the tip of the brush back into some water, pick up another little bit of water. It's like little abstract shapes that I'm following around the wing. It is easy to get lost. It doesn't matter if you don't get it absolutely right. It's just following the basic highlight. More water required. You can see highlights all down here, a thicker patch. And I think I'm going to need to connect one section with another. It's a bigger shape coming through there. Nearly done with the highlights on that wing, so I'll do the same to the other wing, but the other area that I can use the gouache is to put any highlights into the actual sort of hair on the bee. So for instance, around the bottom of the bee, where I flicked in some of the watercolour, it's fairly effective, but if you want to make him look slightly more hairy, you can flick some of this white off of a fine brush and make his bottom look a bit more hairy, or any other section. So again, I'm just using my rigger with enough water in it that it will flow off the brush, and just a very, very tip. And I think that actually gives him a little bit more fluffiness. And in the body of the bee there's a couple of lighter bits of hair, but now if I use the pure white that will be too bright. So what I need to do is to just add a tiny bit of some of my grey into the white gouache, or Chinese white if you're working with watercolour, and then I'm going to use that off the tip of the brush. So rather than it being bright white, I'm now using light grey. In fact, that's still too bright. A little bit more into it, just enough to pick out the odd lighter hair. You will find that the gouache dries down a little bit, you know, the colours mute slightly as it dries. So you can put this in and then you can see how it dries, and you can always go over. But the gouache has to be done at the end because it is water soluble, so if you try and put a wash over the top, once you've used the gouache, it will just disappear on you. So it is the last thing you should do, is to put the gouache into place. So I can build up some of these highlights. So I've just got to do the highlights in the wing and any highlights on the bee, and there's some very tiny little highlights on this kind of antenna, tiny little marks, light marks on the antenna. So I'm going to go back to my light grey, not white but light grey, and I'm just going to put a little hint of some segments on the antenna. It really depends on how much detail you want to put in. If you want to do a much looser approach to this, then you don't need to worry about these little details. It's all down to how much you like the detail. So those are the finishing touches really, and just check you've got your tones right. I mean, I could actually go slightly darker on this, a bit more blue tone into this petal to really push it over, but you know, I might lose some of the nice colours. So I think overall I'm probably going to leave it, and that's it, finished.